morning. I'm Gary Nolte, for those of you that don't know me. This week, we're supposed to be talking about mercy. We're studying the book of Romans, the letter to the Romans from Paul, and we're in the process of going through chapter 11. We were actually supposed to read verses 1 through 35, but in actuality, the lesson is primarily covering verses 17 through 32. I'm going to read portions of it. I'm not going to read the whole chapter. All right. Now, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, though a wild olive branch, were grafted in among them, and have come to share in the rich root of the cultivated tree. Now, do not boast that you are better than those branches. What Paul is talking about in this letter, if some of the branches were broken off, well, first off, the tree is an olive tree, and the olive tree represents Israel. He takes a wild olive branch, because olives do grow wild in that part of the world, and he takes a wild olive branch and grafts it to this tree. The tree is a cultivated tree, therefore it gives a lot of fruit. Normally, when you bring in and do grafting, you take a cultivated branch and graft it to a wild tree or wild root. That way you've got the strength of the wild nature-provided root. In this case, they're referring to the tree as being Israel, God's chosen people. And the grafted wild limb is the Gentiles. The broken branches are the Jews that do not believe in Jesus Christ. They have been broken off from the tree. Now, people say, well, what difference does it make whether it's a cultivated tree or not? Well, the cultivated trees, they produced more fruit because that's where they came from. They picked the trees that produced the most fruit and the better fruit and cultivated them. Now, the cultivated root is reminiscent or reminding of the patriarchs. That's where they come from, or that's what's representative in this example. Do not boast that you're better than those branches. In other words, the branches that got cut off that did not believe. Do not boast that you are a Christian. You didn't earn that. God gave that to you. You believed. That's all you had to do to get it. But you didn't get it through your works or through how good you were. So you don't have anything to boast about. You can be proud, but you shouldn't boast. You're not even contributing to the root. The root is contributing to you. The chapter is broken down into three basic categories. First of all, be humble. That's what we were just talking about. You need to be humbly grateful for God's salvation. And here you have to recognize that some of the Jews were cut off because they didn't believe in Jesus Christ. Salvation is fully dependent upon God and His grace. The second division in the chapter, which is essentially the middle three verses, 11:22 through 24, that's where Paul is highlighting God's kindness and wrath, remembering that He can be either way. Consider the kindness and the sternness of God. All right, verse 22 says that. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Both kindness and sternness must be kept in balance, because both are part of God's character. If you talk only about one, you're not talking about God in truth. Those who refuse to believe are the ones that Paul said, those who fell. Earlier, Paul had answered the rhetorical question about the Jews. Do they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? His answer was a resounding, by no means. In other words, even though they fell, they can come back. They can be grafted back in. 11:11 pretty much describes that. God's purpose was to use the inclusion of the Gentiles to make Israel jealous. In verses 23 and 24, he emphasized God's treatment of both Jew and Gentile, just as believing Gentiles were grafted into the olive tree, so Jews who do not persist in unbelief can be grafted back into the tree. So, even though they have fallen once, God is able to graft them in again. How much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? That's in verse 24. Underlying Paul's argument was the assertion that there is only one tree, deeply rooted in God's salvation action from Abraham to Jesus, into which both believing Jews and believing Gentiles are grafted. All right, the last part of the chapter is titled or labeled as Be Aware. Several issues in this section are difficult to understand, and various scholars, biblical scholars, have interpreted them separately, however, or differently. Paul's purpose to the section is clear. He didn't want the Gentile believers to be conceited because they didn't do anything except believe to be included on the tree. Having a proper perspective of, and this word is in italics for emphasis, mystery that God had revealed to Paul in Christ would rid these believers of the conceit that they may have been tempted to feel toward the unbelieving Jews. When writing to the Ephesian believers, that's in Ephesians 3, verses 3 through 7, Paul explained the mystery, that's the Greek word for mystery, to the inclusion of Gentiles into the body of co-heirs. The mystery relates directly to the salvation of Israel, specifically, and hardening in part that Israel has experienced. The hardening was limited in scope, and not every single member of Israel had hardened, as evidenced by the fact that not every branch was broken out of the cultivated tree. Salvation will always be through faith in Christ's completed work on the cross. Now just listen to that, please. Salvation will always be through faith in Christ's completed work on the cross. In verse 28 and 29, he states that Israel is both an enemy and a friend of God. As far as, I'm going to read verse 28, as far as the gospel is concerned, they are enemies for your sake. But as far as election is concerned, they are loved on account of the patriarchs. They're still God's chosen people. Israel had demonstrated itself to be God's enemy because, by and large, it had rejected the gospel opening the door for Gentiles. Paul dealt with this aspect of Israel's relationship in Romans chapter 9, 30 through chapter 10, verse 21. On the other hand, though, with respect to the election of Israel as God's chosen people, it is loved because of the patriarchs. Paul dealt with this in chapter 11. It is the nourishing root of these patriarchs that are feeding the tree, that are the cultivated bush, the cultivated tree, that the wild limbs are grafted onto. Paul grounded God's love for Israel because of the patriarch and the fact that God's gift and his call are irrevocable. He doesn't take things back. He doesn't revoke. He keeps his promises, always. The Greek word that translates as irrevocable means to be without regret. The gospel continues to be offered to all people, Jews and Gentiles. If you will, read the entire chapter from verse 1 all the way through verse 39. Or verse 36, I should say. Read the entire thing, and that way you'll get the whole context. Thank you, guys and gals, and have a good week.